minutes. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm very pleased that the first guest for Bridge to the Future is Dylan Taylor. And Dylan is a space entrepreneur, space investor, space philanthropist, space philosopher, and he's just done so many things, it's hard to keep up. But he is also founder and CEO of Voyager Space. That's going to be our main topic today. Full disclosure, I do have a financial interest in Voyager Space. Dylan is my publisher, and I am also on the board of advisors of Space for Humanity, a nonprofit that Dylan founded. So, as I said, Dylan is involved in a lot of things that have to do with space and our world, and I think we should just get right to it. So, welcome, Dylan. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Frank. I think you forgot one, which was 2211.world that you and I co-founded together. So, which maybe we touch on that a little bit down the road too.
Yeah, let's talk about that because that's a big addition to the field of space philosophy.
Indeed.
So, Dylan, I know from talking to you already that you've been interested in space exploration since you were a kid. But tell us a little bit about that and then how that general interest evolved into what you're doing today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for the question, Frank. For me, it's honestly earliest possible memory. And I know it's probably not physically possible to remember something at age 2 or 3, but I think I was as young as you can be. And for me, it really was the Star Trek ecosystem. And for me, space, I'm definitely an explorer, which I don't know if we'll get to, some of the other fun things I was able to do here recently. So I definitely have the explorer gene. I am involved in the business side of space, and I'm fascinated by kind of frontier technology. But for me, the real hook in all of this has always been the social impact that space has, the potentiality of space to improve life here on Earth, to have us realize we're fish in the fishbowl, all those kinds of things. And for me, I was just captivated by that Star Trek ecosystem. And this is the early 70s, and the world's similar to today, perhaps, struggling with a whole range of issues. And you had this kind of utopian world where all the problems seemingly had been, addressed or conquered. And so that really appealed to me. And I think that vision for space has always stuck with me. And so most of what I'm doing today, if you were to sort of map this out in a network chart, it all ties to this big idea of how do we get more people out there? How do we drive the overview effect, a term that you coined, of course? And how do we have humanity realize the ability for us to not only do better, but do things in a way that's sort of transformational for our future? And so, yeah, pretty much everything I'm working on is trying to reduce the friction to make that reality possible.
So if we were to say how you envision an ideal future, we might look at Star Trek as an example, even though it's fiction. I know quite a few people in the space industry look at that as the kind of future they'd like to see.
For sure. I'm definitely more Star Trek than Star Wars. Star Wars is a little bit more, adversarial. By the way, I love them both, just for the record. And I love The Expanse, which is a bit dystopian. But yeah, I think my vision would be much more Star Trek, for sure.
Well, one thing I did not mention in the introduction, but it's important in terms of who you are today. Another addition to your resume is you're an astronaut now. You flew on Blue Origin, New Shepard 19.
Mm-hmm.
How has that informed what you're doing today, and how does it affect the way you go about a very busy day in putting together this vision of yours?
Yeah, what it's done, Frank, mostly is lit a fire, literally and figuratively, underneath me to do everything that I'm doing today, but do it just even more passionately, aggressively, quickly, because I have this deep sense of urgency that I think I had previously, but now all of the precepts I had about space have been validated personally and viscerally. And so now it's really, hey, let's really make this happen. You know, we're on this earth for such a short period of time, and how can I really, make an impact? So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really just more accelerated my passion to make all these things happen, and certainly validated what I believe to be true going into the flight. It definitely, and you and I have spoken about the flight in the past, and it just completely smashed all expectations I had, Frank. And this is something I've been thinking about most of my life, and it
Mm.
still was overwhelmingly better than I could have even dreamed.
And it is transformational,
No question.
would you
I mean, I
say?
think not only transformational, but penetrative, right? It's something that I don't think, even if you were to, have some kind of a detox and say, okay, space is bad for some reason, I don't think you could remove it from your core.
Mm.
It's so much a part of your psyche that I don't think you could reverse the process. I really don't.
Right. Right. Well, when I was first thinking about the overview effect, I wasn't thinking about astronauts. I was thinking about this future we're talking about, which was millions of people living and working out there in the solar ecosystem. And so that would be a situation in which what you saw for a few minutes would be something people would see every day, which is the earth and the sky and the universe beyond it. So it's hard to imagine that this future wouldn't have different kinds of people living in it, right?
Right. Indeed.
Yeah. So let's be practical uh, for a minute. Voyager Space is
Mhm.
the company that you have and are using primarily to realize your vision. And it really is a different kind of company in the sense that if I'm correct, and tell me if I'm wrong, it's not a single company. It's more like a holding company that has a number of different companies within it, and it all fits together in some way. But I'd like to hear how does it fit together in terms of what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question. Yeah, it is an operating company. So it's a single company in that sense. And certainly as we look to enter the public markets, down the road at some point in time, there'll be a single, company that's going public.
Mm-hmm.
The way it's been constructed, though, is primarily by acquisition of existent, highly successful, entrepreneurial, innovative companies like Space Micro, like Nanoracks, like Pioneer Astronautics, Altius, several others. And these are companies that have had some success along the way and have been around, have revenue, have profitability, have technology, but they're not necessarily uh, they don't necessarily have the ability to scale and pursue very large projects, especially infrastructure projects. So the thesis was, how do you assemble all these different capabilities and do it in a way that's cohesive and synergistic so that you can then pursue large space station contracts, for example, or other infrastructure projects that require a high degree of capability that heretofore only the prime contractors have been able to do. That's the idea
Mm-hmm.
behind it. And if you're successful, where you end up is sort of prime contractor capable, but denominated on flexible, adaptable, entrepreneurial, DNA, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And the model really was validated when we were one of the winners of the space station replacement
Right.
contract, the so-called CLD. Our space station is called Starlab. We've announced a couple of pretty large partnerships here recently with many nation states and also a couple of private companies. And so that's starting to get some traction. So that's the idea behind it. And as much as I love new space and I'm super passionate about it, we need these capabilities to fly in tighter formation if we're going to actually get these large projects done.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of companies out there now that are entrepreneurial and aggressive and looking for money, of course, looking for investment, but it's hard to see how they can scale up, as you say, and if the long-term vision is really humans throughout the solar ecosystem, you're going to have to be able to do big things. I think I did have a question already in mind, and maybe we'll talk about that. Can you talk a little bit about Starlab? I noticed on the website, I believe you have something called the George Washington Carver Science Lab. That caught my attention.
Yeah.
Tell us about that and tell us how Starlab is maybe different from the other private stations that are being touted.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So we are currently doing business on the International Space Station and doing a lot of the key research missions on station. And so we've actually named that science lab that's existent on International Space Station today, George Washington Carver Science Lab, after the, of course, esteemed naturalist and scientist George Washington Carver, who was, a botanist and probably the original ag tech researcher and many other accolades. On Starlab, which is our space station replacement, we're leaning very, very heavily into the research side of things, Frank. I mean, as passionate as I am, of course, about getting humans up there and, commercial space and all the things we've talked about, the key thing, I think, to ignite the passion around space and really unlock the billions of dollars of funding that we're going to need is to demonstrate to citizens here on Earth how space benefits Earth. And certainly the overview effect is one element of that. But another element of it is actually doing research on orbit that can change people's lives here on Earth, whether that's drug development or whatever the case may be. So we're leaning very heavily into that. And so I think that's a differentiator. But then the other key thing is because we have so much experience doing missions on station, we understand that it's really, really important to design that research and to invest in that research here on terra firma so that you're designing those experiments and you have an understanding of what possible outcomes there might be and how to capture all those before you put it on orbit.
Yeah.
And so we're opening a physical science lab on the campus of Ohio State University. We just announced that last week. Large investments, Jobs Ohio and the governor's office of Ohio are behind the initiative. And we will be building a science lab there on campus that will be, one for one, a terrestrial mapping of what will be on Starlab. So think of it almost as a beta test or a staging area where we're getting all that research designed and all the kinks worked out before we put it on orbit. And a lot of these will, I think, change the world. I mean, ag tech is going to be a key focus. It's one of the main reasons we chose Ohio State, but there's going to be several other research areas of note. So that's really, I think, one of the key differentiators for Starlab.
Will what you're building at Ohio State go into space, or is it just a model that will be replicated there?
The latter, mostly, Frank. I mean, think of it almost as equipment that would be on orbit, and it's just the exact same piece of equipment, but it's on a bench, not in orbit, that you're testing and refining your experiment before you actually put it on orbit, and vice versa. Once you run an experiment on orbit, you bring it back down to refine the results and better understand how you design the next set of experiments.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there's room for several private space stations
I do.
that are all doing different things?
I do. 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I think we're going to build multiple Star Labs ourselves,
Right.
honestly. So,
Right.
yeah, I know it's interesting. Early in the kind of launch revolution, a lot of people in the industry would say, and I won't quote them because they might be embarrassed to be quoted on this, but they'd say, look, there's all these launchers are going to fail, not technically, but because there's not going to be enough demand. And
Mm-hmm.
We are going to enter this world where we're going to have all this capacity and far exceed the current, payload configuration or mass to orbit that we need. And my thesis at the time was, yes, a lot of launchers are going to fail, mainly because it's very hard to get to orbit. There's only been a handful of countries to do it. But I said, in terms of the market, you've got it completely wrong. Launch does not address demand, it creates demand. Because as you build the elevator and as you open up the high frontier, all the use cases go up and all the possibility. Like we're talking about building private space stations now. That's hundreds of thousands of tons of matter going to orbit that wasn't in the model previously, right?
Yeah.
So I think of it very similar with the space stations. People are saying, well, we're going to exceed the capacity of the ISS, and therefore the market is full. I just think that's a silly way to think about it. We're going to open up new beachhead, and the new beachhead will be filled by new opportunities that we're creating, co-creating, as we build that future forward. So yes, there will be multiple space stations, no doubt about that.
Well, I'm reminded the last time I was at Johnson Space Center in 2019, I had a brief conversation with someone who is in charge of lining up science experiments for the ISS. And I was told that there's just not enough room for all of them. Right. And, that there's so many people who want to do something on the ISS that it's really quite a job to schedule them. So it sounds like that confirms what you're saying, that the demand is already there. It's already not being met by the ISS. So, yeah.
Yep.
Are there any other companies like Voyager Space that you know of? Are you unique?
Well, I think the way we've been constructed is unique because it's been primarily via acquisition. And, we're a young company. We're only 3 years old. People forget that. So I think people are, a bit astonished at what we've been able to create in 36 months. But, there are other companies that have grown acquisitively. Redwire comes to mind. And there are other certainly operating companies that have cross-functional capability. All the primes, of course, which are just massively large, but even middle market, what I would consider middle market, kind of mini primes like a Ball Aerospace or we could come up with Sierra Space. There's a few of those companies that are bigger than Voyager that are sort of multi jurisdictional or multi-capable. Maybe that's the right way to say it. Yeah. But as far as I know, we're really unique insofar as having this purpose-built platform that is tied to specific capabilities that we wanted to assemble from day one. And, so not to say we're the only company that has a vision for the future. That's not what I'm saying. But I think we are constructing the company in a way that is different than the way these other companies have been constructed.
I noticed on your website that the term sustainability comes up a lot and ESG comes up a lot. Could you talk about that in terms of the sustainability and social awareness of Voyager Space?
I went to business school at University of Chicago, Frank, as I think you know, and that's sort of a very libertarian kind of last bastion of supreme free speech. But Milton Friedman, you may know, taught there, very influential writer. And he was very outspoken that the business of business is business. Peter Drucker was in that camp. And for years and years and years, I believed that. I said, look, the best thing society can do is have businesses that are focused on being really good businesses and employing people and efficiently allocating capital. I no longer believe that. And I no longer believe that because I think the track record has been very poor. So and I've run large multinational companies, very large multinational companies. If you look at the power and capability that a multinational company has and the ability to affect change across multiple countries and geographies and affect lives and economies, it's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's almost like a nation state level, depending on the kind of platform that you have in terms of being able to affect change. And I think global business has done a very poor job of being good stewards and understanding that we're all playing the long game here, right? Yes, you can maximize everything to the nth degree and harvest, economics and maximize profits. But if you're leaving, a scorched earth behind you, that's not winning. And by the way, it's not good business either, right? Even if you don't care about people, even if you have no empathy, even if you're just a pure sociopath, it's still not smart to run a business that way.
Mm.
So I believe very strongly that businesses have an obligation to society and to each other and to people. Now, that's not to say they shouldn't try to, I'm a capitalist for sure. They should try to allocate capital correctly. They should be rewarded for taking risk with their capital. So, but this multi-stakeholder approach, I think, is really important. So if you believe all that, then you ask yourself, what are our responsibilities, right? And it seems to me we have a lot of issues in space. Diversity is just atrocious. I mean, it's second probably only to Wall Street in terms of lack of diversity. Maybe real estate I'd put up there too, which is an industry I have some familiarity with. But we need to do a much, 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 much better job. And then, of course, we're polluting space with debris. We haven't been terribly sophisticated with the way we put hardware in place. We have no deorbit technology of note, certainly deployed at scale. So these are all the different things that go through my mind in terms of what are our responsibilities, what are our obligations, how do we make a difference? And I think it's really, really, really important. And frankly, I think it's derelict as a leader in any industry to not take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. I think we need to play a much more enlightened game as business leaders.
Did this consciousness happen over time, or was there a moment where it all clicked into place for you?
I think the key program that changed my life regarding this level of responsibility was probably the Henry Crown Fellowship, which is a fellowship at Aspen Institute, which I first participated in 2014.
Yeah.
It was still prevalent in my mind, but that's where it really, I think, solidified in my mind.
And of course, your experience of the overview effect, seeing the Earth as a whole system in which everything's interconnected and interrelated, I think part of that is realizing we all have a responsibility to one another, and there really are no ultimate winners if others in large numbers are losing, obviously.
So, and there is no other, right? There is no other place. There is no other person or people. There's just not, and that viscerally when you're up there, right? And I think we learned this with COVID too, right? I mean, you can't insulate yourself. You just can't. We're all one connected system. We're all one organism in a sense.
Right. Yeah. Well, moving on a bit, one thing that we're interested in, and I'm learning about here in this project, the Bridge to the Future that we're putting together, is investors and companies. And we're curious about your capital market strategy and how you've gone about it, and where you think you're going to go in the future with it.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'm happy to dive in, and if there are other specific questions, happy to address them. But yeah, we were founded, as I mentioned, 3 years ago. The primary capital source at our founding was really, I'll call it friends and family, but these are, pretty well-heeled friends and family, and I put obviously some of my own money in. And we used that to make our first couple of acquisitions and really demonstrate the model. And then we raised our first institutional round at the beginning of 2020, and then used those proceeds to make further acquisitions, specifically nanoracks. And then we raised another institutional round and used that again to make a couple more acquisitions and also invest really in our corporate infrastructure so that we could create a path to enter the public markets at some point in the future. So we've been very, I would say, cautious with the way we've capitalized the company. We don't want to overcapitalize it because then you're essentially, diluting yourself too much, not diluting, diluting yourself too much.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you also want to make sure that you're not cutting it too thin either. And if you hit a market cycle, you've got plenty of cash on the balance sheet. The good news is the companies we've acquired are good companies and they all make money in their own right. So, and I do anticipate a lot of distress. You haven't asked me this, Frank, but I do anticipate a lot of distress in the market here going forward.
Yeah.
And I think there'll be companies that don't make it, but yeah, that's how we've capitalized the company. Our investment bank is JP Morgan, which I think most people have heard of. And yeah, we're sitting in a good position right now. I don't want to take that for granted, but I'm feeling good about where the company is.
You've alluded to going public. Do you want to say anything about that at this point?
It's one of many possibilities that we're considering, and I think we're of the mind that going public via SPAC is not a responsible way to go public. Never say never, and we're fiduciaries, so we return all phone calls. I'll put it that way. But in my mind, going the SPAC route skips a few steps in terms of being a high quality public company. So we've been pretty vocal that if and when we go public, we'll do it the old fashioned way. And hopefully be the first new space company to really go public in that standard fashion, or what used to be standard. I mean, now it's unique to go public that way, which I think is ironic, but yeah.
I don't know if this is a question that's easy to answer except speculatively, but what do you think the space tech world, how will the space tech world weather some pretty rough waters ahead economically?
Yeah, it'll be pretty ugly, I think, Frank. We haven't really stress tested the industry in a while. COVID didn't really do it because you had PPP loans and other things kind of backstop a lot of these companies. And we still, to your point, had healthy capital markets and low interest rates, right? Yeah. So we have a situation where interest rates are rising, the dollar is strengthening, and economic activity is slowing, and debt's at an all-time high. That's a tough recipe. That's the 1970s, right? I mean, that's almost exactly what it is. So, and highly inflationary, right? So, high inflation, low growth is classic stagflation. And the other thing that I believe to be true is the difference between a good leader, a good business leader, and a exceptional business leader is their ability to manage a business cycle. And most of the people in the industry, well, I shouldn't say, half the people, I'm guessing, in the industry leading companies, new space companies, have never seen a cycle. True. And you need some scar tissue typically to kind of get through these things. So I think it'll be pretty ugly. I think we'll lose some companies for sure. We've already lost a couple to bankruptcy. So I think a lot of companies, even good companies, will have to be recapitalized, right? Some of these companies that went public via SPAC, the equity will go to zero. Doesn't mean the company will have to liquidate in bankruptcy, but they will have to be restructured. And I anticipate that happening to several of the publicly traded SPAC companies.
Would you make a comparison to the computer industry in the late 90s? I'm not sure that really went downhill because of the market conditions like we see today, but there was a lot of white hot activity for a while, and then the bubble burst. I'm just not sure if the comparison is apt. I wonder what you think.
I think it is, in the sense that whenever you have a cycle, that it's a pendulum, right? So the more I swing the pendulum one way or the other, the harder it's going to swing back in the other direction. That's very much how business cycles behave. And new space has been super hot. I would say, maybe too hot for a long period of time. And so the consequence of that is you're going to have some, pretty deep distress. Mm-hmm. So I think it's similar in that sense, that, you're going to have these kind of wild gyrations. And part of it is price discovery. This is the other thing people I don't think fully appreciate about market cycles. It's mainly has to do with the market doesn't know how to price things, right? Because investors are always looking to invest, always, right? There is no time when an investor isn't looking to invest. But if they don't know how to price it, they don't know how to assign risk, then they just go pencils down, because they don't know where the market is. So I think that's what we need to get through, is price discovery. And there will be a lot of companies that just don't have enough cash to ride out that storm.
Yeah. Well, why don't we ask this question then? What would you advise investors looking at SpaceTech to do, or what metrics should they use? How should they think about this at this point in time?
Well, I'm in the camp. It's not investment advice, by the way, Frank. It's just one person's opinion. But I'm in the camp that says you bet the jockey, not the horse, right? And so I would look for high quality management teams that have experience, that are sufficiently prudent, right? You don't want people who are so anti-risk that they don't see opportunities, but you don't want, shoot, ready, aim cowboys either, especially in a market like this. The idea is way less important than the execution of the idea.
Yeah.
So I would look for high quality management teams, as I said, and certainly the technology matters, what segment they're participating in matters, all that stuff matters, but management team. And then I would look at their cap structure. One of the things that I was mentored on, earlier in my career, is there's a difference between a good company and a good investment, right? So you can have a good company, but if their cap table is broken and their capitalization is very convoluted, then you still wouldn't invest, right? Mm-hmm. Because you could kind of win the battle and lose the war, right? You can bet on the right company, but you could have no economics left over by the time that they're in a position to give you liquidity.
Mm. Do you feel like your experience in non-space related companies has been helpful to you? Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs in the space tech field, that's the only field they've ever been in. You were in other industries, and I have a feeling, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but was that helpful in this particular world?
Oh, no question. No question about it. It's interesting. Early on, when I first came into the industry, I sort of prognosticated on some of the things that were going to happen. And a lot of them came to pass, and people were like, how in the heck did you know that? And I said, well, look, this is classic industry dynamics, right? It doesn't necessarily depend on what industry it is. And things typically evolve in very similar cases, right? Ending up with a big four oligopoly at the top of the market, having disruption that comes from lower use cases. These are all themes that persist in other industries.
Yeah.
So I used to joke with people, the only thing that's surprising to me is that people are surprised.
Yeah. I recall I was at an MIT event that was really focused on space business. And one of the speakers, I would give credit if I could remember who said it, but he said the best way to be successful in the space business is to strike the word space out, and always remember that it is a business.
Mhm.
It sounds like what you just said too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think there are a couple of nuances to the industry because the technical risk is a bit unique, and there are very few people who can diligence the technical risk because it is, rocket science. Forgive the expression.
Yeah.
But other than a few, and then you have regulations like ITAR and CFIUS and other things that are nuanced to the industry. But I agree with whoever that speaker was. I think, I don't know, it might have been me because I think I've said something similar to
It might have been you.
that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I agree with that premise.
Yeah. Um, where do you think the opportunities are going to be now? I mean, uh, we've got, at this point, we've got satellites. What can we say about that? I mean, that is one of the most successful areas of space tech, and it's going to continue to be. We now see the private space stations. We now see people talking about cislunar space or cislunar economy. Do you think is the cislunar economy something you can relate to, or is that a bit premature?
No, it's one of our three focus areas. So Voyager is focused on low Earth orbit destinations, including space stations, orbital servicing, and servicing the LEO and MEO hardware uh, environments, and then cislunar. And cislunar is everything from PNT, position, navigation, and timing, communication protocols, all the kind of railroad tracks you need for the cislunar economy, to actual infrastructure that you would land on the moon in anticipation of um, long-term settlement on the moon. So yeah, I think those are good areas. When people ask me what areas to focus on, I always ask them, "What's your time horizon?" And to a lesser extent, what's your risk profile? Um, if you're looking for liquidity, in the next couple of years, I wouldn't recommend any of those industries or subgroups because they're longer term plays, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think in the short to medium term, I still believe the data play in space is the smarter bet. Now that we're putting hardware in orbit, we're generating the ones and zeros. How do you create predictive analytics and products and services around that hyperspectral data in real time that give people real insights that drive real efficiencies here on Earth? And I think
Yeah.
that's going to be a $1 trillion market, truly.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I talked about briefly in the overview effect was the concept of planetary management,
Mhm.
which I think speaks to what you just said. We've got the satellites in orbit, we've got the computers on the ground. We also have artificial intelligence to look at all the data and come to conclusions about it. I think another term that might be more pleasant to some people's ears is planetary stewardship. But really, the idea is managing all the different factors that go into quality of life on planet Earth.
Mhm.
Um, we we have the capability to do that. I think it's a matter of really choosing to use it at this point.
Agreed.
Um, and I believe it also speaks to your point about really making it clear that the space environment can be used for the benefit of the terrestrial environment
Mhm.
and should be and can be. Yeah.
Agreed.
Uh, when I talked to Sarah Sabri, the second citizen astronaut from your nonprofit, Space for Humanity, when I asked her big takeaway, it was that space and Earth are incredibly close. Um, I think one of the things people don't really understand about the term space is that could mean the Andromeda galaxy, which is on the wall behind me.
Mm.
That can mean the moon, or it can mean low Earth orbit. And we use this term to cover all of it. But back in the shuttle days, I used to say, on the shuttle, you can get into space faster than you can go from Boston to New York.
Right.
And people in Boston were amazed, and people in New York were amazed. But um, did you get that feeling too from your flight that this environment is actually fairly close?
I didn't, only because for me, and I think when you and I spoke actually the day of my space flight, which I have a vague recollection of because I was in some kind of euphoria, but to me it was more like a gate or a portal. And
Yeah,
so I think of space kind of in the traditional sense that it's the other. It's the thing that we choose to think is foreign when in reality it's the exact opposite, right? The entire universe is not this.
yeah.
So that kind of was how I experienced it.
Hmm.
I certainly understand the point. I think Sarah's viewpoint is probably more enlightened than others because she's taking the next step, right? She's taking the Cosmo hypothesis step, if I can
Yeah,
use that term, Frank, which is the sequel uh, or one of the sequels to the Overview Effect, which I think is an exceptional book that people should pick up and read. But it's really this notion of, a without giving too much away, a broader overview effect. And
right.
I intellectually that makes sense, but that wasn't the sense I had when I was up there.
Well, I think the Cosmo hypothesis also begins to ask the question of what is humanity's purpose
Mhm.
out there?
Right.
Do we have a purpose other than pure exploitation? And just about every astronaut I ever talked to got a feeling that, yeah, there is something we have to add, something we can give as well as something we can get from the universe
Right.
as a whole.
Indeed.
Yeah. Um, it does raise a question that I really didn't have on my list, but I can't avoid asking it because one thing that you've also done among the many accomplishments is that you produced a book and a film about Gerard K. O'Neill.
Hmm.
And Gerard K. O'Neill was a visionary in the 70s and 80s who imagined building space communities using extraterrestrial material, uh, asteroids, for example. And again, people tend to think of those communities as being far away,
Hmm.
but he imagined them in the Lagrange points, uh, very close to the Earth and Moon. Have you given any thought to how his vision might be realized in a practical sense?
I have, yeah. And again, the way my brain works is I think I start with the end state, like you just articulated, spinning, uh, gravity induced space station at L5.
Hmm.
And I think to myself, what are the impediments to making that happen?
Hmm.
And if we're talking on the technical side, we're not going to, as our first commercial space station, build something out at L5, right? Which is, well, L2 is at 1,000,000 miles, 1.4 million, or 1.4 million kilometers. I'm not sure how far L5 is, but the point is we're not going to start there, right? So as a first step, we need to build private commercial space stations in low Earth orbit
Hmm.
with different technologies and certainly different cost structures. And so to me, that's the necessary next step, right?
Hmm.
I think I said in another interview, think of us as life emerging from the sea, right? We're that fish that flopped onto the beach, the very first, uh, sign of life that actually, entered the non wet world, so to speak. But we're just at the very cusp of that. So to get into the forest, we need to take stock and build an infrastructure layer there before we can take that next step.
It's really an evolutionary step, evolutionary process. And I think in the book, I called that the explorer fish. And yeah, that's where we are. That's what the astronauts are. They're the explorer fish.
Yep.
Coming back and telling us about land. Yeah, very
Indeed.
interesting. Yeah.
Indeed.
So another initiative that you mentioned is 2211.world,
Mm-hmm.
and this is a website dedicated to space philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but why should a person interested in space business care about space philosophy? What do you see as the connection there, and how does it matter?
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned previously, the key thing for me and the reason I'm so excited about space is this social change element to it. Business to me is a way to facilitate the end state, which is, how to get more people up there and change the world.
Right.
So I'm very much into sort of the intellectual part of it. That's what attracted me, of course, to your book, Frank, and others. And I do think there are people who have, I think, wrong-headed, and by the way, I fully support people's ability to have different point of views, but they have wrong-headed views on why space is not something we should be focusing on, right? And by the way, there are a lot of good points in that
Right.
camp, but I think at a minimum, we need a forum to be able to debate those ideas, right? And I think, not to speak for you, Frank, but I think we agree on this, that one of the things I don't think we're doing particularly well in society today is listening to points of view that might not necessarily align with our current way of thinking. And I don't think for something as nebulous, no pun intended, as space, something that hasn't been fully defined yet, like what are the ethics of landing on another planetary body, right? These kinds of questions that haven't been debated, and questions, frankly, that haven't even been properly formulated.
Right.
So we need a forum where people can express themselves and talk about that. So that was the idea behind 2211. And just quickly on the time, the 2211, people say, "What? That's a weird name. What's that all about?" And the idea was that would be the 250th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin going to space, the first human going to space. Right. So the idea was it's far enough in the future that it's the future, right? You've got to really stretch to imagine what the world looks like, but it's not so, it's not the year 4055 or something where you can't even imagine, what are humans even going to be? Are we going to be on microchips and all that kind of stuff? So it was meant to be futuristic but tangible. Yeah. That was the idea behind it.
Well, there's another aspect to it that I think is important, which is philosophy can be defined very esoterically as having to do with complicated words like ontology and epistemology, which are hard to remember and understand. But if you look at the definition, philosophy can also mean a way of doing things. My philosophy of how to write a book is I write something every day. That's a philosophy. And I believe that 2211 and other efforts at space philosophy can give us a framework for how we take on this great adventure and how we avoid being sad about the outcome, because we all know we regret a lot of the ways the great exploration of Earth took place in the last 500 years. So I believe a lot of people in the space tech business and the nonprofit side of it are concerned that we don't do it as well as we should. And I think 2211 World can help people think those things through, as you said.
Agree. And at least, at least formulate the right questions to have a conversation about. So I agree. And I enjoy it. I like contributing to it. I like reading other people's pieces. We have other things on there. I know you know this because you're a co-founding executive editor, Frank. But for those of you who don't know, there are things on there like poetry and music and videos and other mediums of expression.
One thing I'm reminded of that I haven't told you, Dylan, when you mentioned 250 years from Yuri Gagarin's flight, I recently decided that I was going to date history from that flight. And so I am considering this the year 61 OE.
Love it.
The year 61 overview effect era. And
yes.
People have started to notice that I think that way. It's a paradigm shift, but I just think for me personally, that is a critical date in terms of everything you and I have been talking about for the last several years. So that's.
I think it's genius. I think it's genius. I hadn't heard you. I didn't know that. That's awesome, Frank.
I unconsciously put it on a PowerPoint recently for a presentation, and I said, I consider this the year 61 OE, and people said, "Oh yeah, I noticed that on the title of your PowerPoint." I didn't know what you were talking about, but it's a good way to start the conversation.
Having just emerged from a discotheque in Paris at Yuri's Night IAC, which was fun and over the top, I can only imagine what Yuri's Night 250 looks like in the standard year 2211.
Yeah, I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
But it also speaks to some of your other initiatives. You've also, as I mentioned, you're my publisher, and you founded Multiverse Media, which includes Multiverse Publishing. Mm-hmm. You also did start Space for Humanity, which is a nonprofit. Could you speak about both of those and how they fit into your larger interests?
Yeah, sure. So Multiverse Media is really just meant to aggregate some of these media-related projects. But within that universe, no pun intended, you have the production company, which made the film on Jerry O'Neill called The High Frontier. We're currently actively making another film. It should be out in February on the space economy. And 2211 is part of Multiverse Media. And I think we've addressed that. There's an events company called Ad Astra Dinners that's part of it. That's more influencing the influencers from other industries and kind of getting them to understand, how important the events company Ad Astra Dinners is influencing the influencers. So people that would be well known in their industries, better understanding how important these questions are within space. And then, of course, we have the publishing company, which is all about promoting and publishing science and technology books with a particular emphasis on space. So, and then we have some other properties, I'll call them, that are more retail news and information sites for the space industry. Yeah. So the idea behind that whole umbrella is how do we further the message? How do we educate people about the industry and the issues? So that's a key thing. And then on Space for Humanity, this is all about democratizing space and getting people access to space, the right kinds of people that are from a diverse background that have ambassadorial skills and can experience the overview effect, and then come back and actually have a positive impact here on Earth. And as you mentioned, we've sent 2 people to space just in the past 6 months, which is really extraordinary when I think about it. And they're both complete rock stars in every sense of the word, and they're already making a big difference.
One of the insights I had in writing the overview effect many years ago was that we can use space-related activities to shape the consciousness of people on this planet, and we can use it to make social change. And I really believe Space for Humanity is an instrument for that. Um, Katya, the first citizen astronaut, I believe she was, correct me if I'm wrong, the first Mexican-born woman astronaut.
Indeed. Yep,
Yeah.
that's right.
And Sarah is the first Egyptian astronaut.
She might be the first African.
Yeah.
Let me get this straight. She might be the first African-born woman to go.
Yeah. I believe you're right. And in any event, part of the Space for Humanity vision is that whoever wins or succeeds in becoming a Space for Humanity astronaut makes an agreement to come back and do something on Earth, bringing back the overview effect experience and the new awareness they have to make life better here. I think that fits in with your idea that you talked about Starlab. You wanted to do things there that are directly relevant to improving the quality of life here on Earth. And my experience is that whether you're talking about business or nonprofits or whatever you're doing, um, people who are not interested in exploring outer space are incredibly interested in the terrestrial environment.
Mm-hmm.
They're incredibly interested in climate change. And so, again, the effort to remove the division between Earth and space and show their connection is very, very important.
Totally agree. Yep.
You've always got to give advice, Dylan, when you're experienced and you've accomplished a lot. So I have to ask you, if I were someone with a great idea and I wanted to be an entrepreneur in space tech, what would your advice be?
Find a mentor.
Find a mentor? Yeah.
Yep. I think that's the number one accelerant for career development.
Go to conferences. I mean, the next question is, how do I find a mentor?
What I found, first of all, if you're really clear on what you need and what you want, and your intentions are pure, and you really spend time reflecting on that, and you are really clear on people, here's who I am, here's what I'm trying to do, and here's why I'm trying to do it. People will, the universe, so to speak, will rearrange itself to help you do that. But it all starts with your intent, right? What's your intent? If your intent is to get rich and become famous, you might have some short-term success doing that, but I think long-term that's a trap.
Yeah.
There's a few traps. There are a few blind alleys in life. Those are two of them: fame, and money.
Dylan, you've covered just about everything I could imagine. I know that without getting into more future speculation, we have more projects going, and this is not the end. Maybe it's the beginning. So maybe there will be another podcast in the future. But for now, I want to thank you for taking all this time. I can't imagine, just having taken a recent look at your website, I can't imagine running Voyager Space and all the other things you're doing. But I really appreciate the hour and some minutes we've had. I just want to ask if you have any final comments. Is there something I should have asked and I didn't?
No, I don't think so, Frank. I think we covered it all. And again, you're an inspiration to me. I've told you that privately, but I'll say that publicly so everyone understands that. And I really appreciate all you've done for the industry and for helping us on this path. And we didn't talk about DART, right? We just crashed a probe into a satellite, which I think was one of the coolest things I've seen, probably since the SpaceX Falcon Heavy dual landing is probably the coolest thing I've seen. And so I feel like we're living in the future. I feel like we are where we thought we were going to be finally. And I'm just super excited to get out of bed in the morning. So
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you. And my ideas, I'm an entrepreneur of ideas, as you know. And while we're having a little mutual admiration here, I'd have to say most people wouldn't be aware of my ideas if you weren't publishing them. So I have to thank you for what you're doing.
It's my pleasure. It's my honor, actually, Frank. It really is.
Well, thanks again, Dylan. This has been a great kickoff to Bridge to the Future. And as we were talking today, I thought, wow, that is really a pretty good name for our project here. And I look forward to continuing to work on this with Intro Act and also Starbridge Venture Capital. And we will have some more fascinating guests in the future. So thanks again, Dylan. It's been great.
Thank you, Frank. My pleasure. Great being on.